one of the most common and challenging problems of natural language communication is ambiguity. And therefore, it's also challenging when we're documenting our requirement using textual methods or approaches. And instead of giving you an example first, this time we're going to start with a definition. A requirement is ambiguous if it allows more than one interpretation, even though the relevant context, like other requirements, application, domain, software, system, is known. So if something allows for more than one interpretation, then we have a problem and we would like to avoid that. Why? Because if you have more than one potential interpretation of a problem, you tend to choose one, but the problem is you do not choose it consciously, but rather unconsciously. So ambiguity is an underspecification that is typically a phenomenon of natural language. And the solution, the unconscious solution of ambiguity is often a cognitive process where you take the context or other cues into account that make most sense to you. So the most likely interpretation of a requirement is chosen unconsciously, thus the interpretation causing the least contradiction with already known requirements. So based from what you have in your mind about like how you understand the problem, how you understand the system, and all the other extra knowledge that you might have from your background, those you use to choose to understand a problem or a requirement with the least contradictions so that it makes most sense to you. But for a different person who might have a different background and a different understanding of the system, there might be a different solution that makes more sense. And if you have an ambiguous requirement, there might be two, three, four of those possible interpretations, and that's a problem, because if you give it to two developers and you get two different product backs, then you have a problem. This is not what you're looking for. So ambiguity in that sense is a sign of incompleteness, that there's something missing or that it's not as good defined and specified as you would like to have it. So you have to make sure that those contradictions do not occur, and so that no one can by accident solve them unconsciously. And to address that, there are like a few approaches, and then we'll look into this now a little bit more. But how does this now relate to the software engineering process? It is one of the major problems that tend to show up quite late. So ambiguity being the source of problems that show up very late. So if you have ambiguous requirements, you might not notice this until the integration of software components or the acceptance test, or in worst case, only when people start using the system, that multiple people come back to you who all expect different behavior from the system, which you can then trace back to an ambiguous requirement. So that's a big problem. Is it a big and frequent problem? Yes, because if you look at surveys with specification techniques, you tend to learn that the omissions and conflicts in specifications are noticed more often than ambiguities, because they're easier to track. Ambiguities are rather self-interpreted and more often misinterpreted than other types of defects. Requirements engineering specific ambiguities are a frequent problem. Linguistic ambiguities, like language-based, are more like or less of a common problem, and actually a rare problem if you go back to those surveys. So one of the reasons why you as requirements engineers need to pay attention to this problem in particular, because it's going to be a huge challenge to you, and to properly handle this challenge, you need to properly understand ambiguities, the different types and categories of ambiguities, and what are the cues and the clues to find them. So let's first talk about the different categories of ambiguity. First, conscious ambiguity. A client wants to keep requirements open, e.g. usual in public projects. So if it's too vague. Unconscious ambiguity, the client expects a certain interpretation of the requirement. Ambiguity occurs as expectation of the customers and clients are not shared. So what we just discussed on the previous slides. Then there's linguistic ambiguity, inherent attributes of the natural language. Flying airplanes can be dangerous, which is very vague. And then requirements engineering specific ambiguities arise from interpretation of a requirement via background knowledge, other requirements, or from a different domain, and so on. So always make sure that all the information are there to properly interpret a requirement. So 4 different categories of ambiguity: conscious, unconscious, linguistic, and requirement-specific ambiguity. So besides the 4 categories of ambiguity, we also have different types of ambiguity. For example, vagueness, we're talking about a continuum of interpretations with diffuse classification and the summarized version of the interpretation which is available. For example, the text editor has to respond to user input in an adequate time. What is adequate? Is it 10 seconds or 15 or 20? Is it too fast? Is it too slow? So you can see there is it's very vague. Then we also have generality, where you have a continuum of interpretations, but exact classifications, summarized versions of the interpretations are also available. So for example, the ATM shall increase the market coverage of the bank company XYZ by at least 5%. Market coverage measured by what? And you see there's like something missing. Another example, no charge for ATM transactions. User interface should require as few user interactions as possible. What is as few as possible? 4, 5, 6 would be specific. As few as possible could be 100, could be 1,000. So too general. Then there's genuine ambiguity, where you have countable numbers of interpretations, no summarized version of the interpretation is available, and immediate clarification is required. And there we further differentiate between lexical and syntactic genuine ambiguity. Lexical means I have a term with several, in most cases, related meanings. For example, when the user presses the L and R button simultaneously, alarm is turned off. The current alarm or the ability to sound alarms? What is it? And from a syntactic perspective, syntactic genuine ambiguity, where we talk about a structure of a sentence that is not clear without ambiguity. For example, the customer enters a card with a code. Is the code read from the card or is it typed in? What is it? 2 potential, or at least 2 possible interpretations are available here. 2 more subcategories of the genuine ambiguity are semantic and referential. Semantic is that you have a sentence which can be translated into several logic terms. As an example, an alarm must be triggered if an aircraft is identified as hostile and as an unknown mission, or in case the aircraft is able to reach the protected airspace within 5 minutes. Is the and or the or the stronger binding operator? Which one to prioritize? And in case of referential, you have a reference to an object that is ambiguous to a previous sentence or a subordinate clause. So the customer enters a card and numeric personal code. If it is not valid, then the ATM rejects the card. What is not valid? Is it the card or is it the code? And finally, as a 3rd example here, the product shall show all roads predicted to freeze. What's the reference of all roads? What does it refer to? Then there's also the discourse ambiguity. It's where a requirement is ambiguous in relation to other requirements. As an example, we have A1. When the XYZ button is pressed, the head-up display shows the aircraft's current coordinates. A2. When the aircraft is not airborne, the HUD shows the current weather conditions. That raises the question, will the coordinates be displayed if the XYZ button is pressed and the aircraft is currently not airborne? What's supposed to happen? What will occur? And then example 2. The first dunning letter has to be created after 2 weeks and the second after 4 weeks. At that time, the system is also sending a notice to the responsible official in charge. Is the notice sent after 2 or after 4 weeks or even after 6 weeks? What is the expected and appropriate behavior of the system that we're looking for? So besides the different types of ambiguity and different categories of ambiguities, textual requirements documentation has some general quality problems that you as the requirements engineer should be aware of. because most requirements nowadays are still documented using text. And there are a few typical problems, like the fact that requirements are described unnecessarily restrict, so too restrictive, too much text for too little range of error, or that there are unnecessary requirements. Single users request highly specialized functions, or the requirement does not contribute to the software system goals because it's just something where one particular stakeholder thinks this is super important, but in general, if you zoom out, it's yeah, it's nonsense. Inconsistent, that requirements are inconsistent with the goals of the software system, standards, or directives, or redundant with other information that are already provided in the requirements document. And to avoid those, we have some solutions for you, or one solution in particular called style guides. And this is what we're going to cover in the next video.